And it's recording. Let me go ahead and share.
So are you going to be monitoring the chat?
Yes. So I'm going to monitor the chat, and I wonder too at the end with the Q&A, do you want to just answer questions that are there, or do you want me to ask you the questions?
If you want to feed me questions, that's great. These always depend. I'm always surprised. Sometimes it goes faster than I think it will. Sometimes it goes slower than I think it will. So I don't know how much time I will have, but it's 50 minutes, right?
Yes. 50 minutes, and then we've left 5 minutes for like a Q&A.
Okay. That should be fine.
So we should be good. Oh, we're good.
Yeah, I've been peeking over my daughter's shoulder. She's been doing the morning sessions, and the chats are insane.
Yeah, I will be watching that. That's my job.
Because I've been teaching on Zoom some of my college classes, and I'm like, well, I can manage that chat because there's only a few comments, but
yeah, I will be watching that, trying to look for questions kids might have and everything. So
perfect.
Let's see how we're doing. Ooh, yeah, we already have 23 participants watching us talk while we sit here. It's great. So you are a professor at SUU.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's where I just got my degree.
Yeah, I saw that. You did it online though, right?
Yeah, I did it through my school district.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was great. I kind of wished I had went to college there, like the full college experience there after doing.
Yeah.
I really liked my professors and everyone I worked with. So
yeah,
really
they have some great people. And you can hear the carillon bell here in the background. I'm using my work office.
I like that. Give it another minute. Oh, it's 11 o'clock. So we're actually going to go ahead and get started. So hopefully all of you are here for Rosalyn Eves' class, Love at First Read, Writing Effective First Chapters. So important that we are doing that. So just a reminder as we move in, no inappropriate comments in the chats. Don't share your personal information. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And if somebody asks a question that you really want to have answered, you can like that question and it will pop it up higher in the list, which makes it more likely to be answered. So, Rosalyn grew up in the Rocky Mountains, dividing her time between reading books and bossing her siblings to perform her dramatic scripts. As an adult, the reading and telling of stories is still one of her very favorite things to do. She has a PhD in English and emphasis on rhetoric and composition from Penn State, and she teaches writing at Southern Utah University. Her historical fantasy trilogy, Blood Rose Rebellion, Lost Crow Conspiracy, Winter War Awakening, is out now with Knopf and Random House. And her historical coming-of-age novel, Beyond the Map Stars, which from what you've talked about, I can't wait for that, released summer 2020. So is that out now?
Oh, it should be summer 2021. Oh my goodness.
Oh, okay, yeah, I think it's probably a typo in here. I was like, that's out already? I did not know that.
Yeah, we're still editing.
All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and make Rosalyn the host and turn the time over to her. She has a wealth of knowledge for you.
All right, I am going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys. Can you guys all see this opening screen? It should say Love at First Read on a green page with kind of a book and a heart. Okay, looks like people can see that. All right, I wanted to give you just a little bit about my background. These are the books that Margie just mentioned. So I've been writing for a while now, but as far as this opening page, I really got interested in the way opening chapters work when I worked for a couple years as a Pitch Wars mentor, and I was reading 60, 70 opening chapters trying to decide, you know, which of these writers we're going to work with. And there were several things that made some of the best opening chapters stand out. And so that is some of what we want to talk about. I wanted to ask a question first, and Margie, maybe if you can volunteer some of the answers from the chat. What draws you into a book? When you pick up a book and you start flipping through it, what makes you want to keep reading?
All right, we'll wait and see what the panelists have here. Okay, so some of them said the cover, the interesting characters to root for, suspense in an opening chapter is something they look for, mystery. A lot of them look according to genre.
Yeah.
Interesting character inner dialogue, anticipation of progress, world building or world depth, a great first page. And this is a good one. It says it drops you into the world immediately in a way that makes you feel like you're part of the story.
Yes. These are all great answers, and a lot of them are things that we're going to talk about. I threw this cartoon in just because it made me laugh. Most of you, I imagine, have libraries that look a little bit like this. All right, these are the specific elements that we're going to talk about. And I want to make it clear at the beginning, these are just tools. Please don't feel like you have to put all of these onto the first page, or you will have a very crowded first page. These are just different techniques that I've noticed that authors use to make their first page more engaging and to pull you into the story. So we're going to talk about opening hook, we're going to talk about promises, questions that you leave for the reader, character voice. This is something a lot of you mentioned. We'll talk about the setting, and we'll talk about using an intriguing situation as part of the opening scene. Some general tips for openings. I liked this quote from Stephen King. An opening line should invite the reader to begin the story. It should say, listen, come in here. You want to know about this. I think that's great advice because it means there's not any one thing that you have to do. All you have to do is draw the reader in and invite them to keep reading. But what we're going to talk about now are some specific tips for how you do that. One question that I like to ask when I'm looking at my beginnings, now beginnings are an interesting thing. I've had some books where the first scene that I wrote saved the first scene all the way to the end. The final book in my trilogy, I rewrote that opening like 5 times. I wrote it once and my editor said, I like this, but I think it starts too soon. So I cut 30 pages off and started there. It's just, no, I still think we're starting too soon. So I cut off like another 20 pages. So sometimes it can take you a while to find that right opening. One of the things that helps me is to think about, where does the story end? And then trying to find a way to make my opening kind of a mirror inverse of the story, or to reflect that ending in some way. Another question you want to ask yourself is, why this day? Why does your story start on this day over all other days? Sometimes we have a tendency, because we've been told you want to give your readers some time to get to know your characters before you drop them into the new world. Sometimes we think that means we need an entire chapter about their ordinary life. Sometimes maybe, but that's not always what it means. What you want to be thinking about is, why does their life start to change on this particular day? And that's where you want the story to start. All right. This is an opening, and I will admit that I wrote this opening specifically to do some of the things that I've seen people do in openings, some of which work and some of which don't. So I'm going to read this, and then I want to know, what do you think? What works? What doesn't work? I watched the last bridge of Kiovara fall, the reinforced glass crumbling under the onslaught of the Borgia's aerial assault. The bridge had been one of 7, radiating from the capital city like the arms of a star. Even the Kiovaran kestrels astride their genetically enhanced falcons couldn't save it. The city was surrounded now. We'd never be able to airlift everyone out before the Borgia's amphibious tanks crawled up out of the ocean and overran the streets. Already I could see them climbing the rock base of the city like so many spiders. Amryn. She'd been posted to the bridge, but there was no way she survived. Tears pricked my eyes, but I pushed them away. I didn't have time to grieve. I had to get to the city. Though how, with the bridges gone and the Borgias loose in the street? And save Amryn's sister Veralis. Amryn would expect it of me, and the survival of Kiovara might depend on it. All right, what do you think? Let's start with, what does this introduction do well?
All right, let's see what they think. All right, so they said immediately introduces us to an interesting world, drops us into the action, high stakes, dramatic, gives us a good sense of the genre that they're going to be reading, super good description of the world and action at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah, character too.
Okay, what maybe doesn't work as well?
Ooh, let's see. Who is the narrator? What is their gender? Why does Amryn matter as being the narrator? Some said rather introduce the main character and not necessarily all the other characters at the same time. Someone else, let's see, Emma said it's a complete information vomit. Too much new technology, too many characters, too much of everything all at once. Some said it's confusing because of that, because of the high amount of information that's contained in there.
Yeah. And this was an issue that I saw a lot with the Pitch Wars novels that I saw. And I'm using Pitch Wars because these were not published novels. These were still novels in process. And so they were still figuring some of this stuff out. But I saw a lot of books where the writer was so desperate that you know everything cool that they threw it all at you at the beginning. And it feels like trying to drink from a fire hose, right? You just can't take it all in. Another common thing that I saw is that often something very dramatic would happen on the opening scene, like this character's friend dying. But I'm guessing that most of you felt absolutely nothing when you found out somebody had just died because you don't know who this person is or why you should care about it. You don't even know enough about the main character to know what their relationship is. And so I think when you're looking at starting your opening, you want to think about what draws readers in, but you don't have to throw it all at them at once. Pick a couple of things that you think will work best for your story and the genre that you're writing and focus on those. And it's okay actually to slow down a little bit. Readers want to connect with the character. We want to care about the character. And if you drop us into the middle of a war scene without letting us connect to the character, we really don't care if that character lives or not. And that's not where you want your readers to be. So having established that, let's talk about some of the things you do want to do. The first thing I want to talk about is a hook. And the hook often comes from the premise of the book. What makes your story unique? These are a couple of books that have come out in the last few years that I thought had really interesting premises. One, These Vicious Masks, featured that the tagline was X-Men in Regency England. So you have these people with superpowers, but in a setting where we don't often see superheroes. The picture that's here of Justina Ireland's Dread Nation is fantastic, and the basic premise is a civil war ended because of a zombie outbreak. And so we've gotten rid of slavery, but instead African Americans are being used to fight on the front lines of a zombie apocalypse. Daughter of the Pirate King, a girl pirate has to infiltrate the enemy by dressing as a boy. In Elizabeth Acevedo's Clap When You Land, the story starts when two young women both lose their father and then discover that they both had the same father. One of them is in New York City, one of them is in the Dominican Republic. So these two separate families that had no idea about each other. And then of course, probably a lot of you are familiar with Holly Black's The Cruel Prince, which starts, of course, when a human girl and her sisters are raised in theory after their stepfather kills their parents. Now, not every book is going to have a super unique premise. That's okay. I mean, there's only so many new ideas, and execution matters a lot to making a story unique. But if your story has a really unique premise, you want to think about how can I start hinting at this, if not on the first page, then fairly quickly. And this is from TRICIA LEVENSELLER's Daughter of the Pirate King, which has a fantastic opening. I hate having to dress like a man. The cotton shirt is too loose, the breeches too big, the boots too uncomfortable. My hair is bound on the top of my head, secured in a bun underneath a sailor's hat. My sword is strapped tightly to the left side of my waist, a pistol undrawn on my right. The clothing is awkward as it hangs loose in all the wrong places, and the smell. You'd think men did nothing but roll around in dead fish guts while smearing their own excrement on their sleeves. But perhaps I shouldn't complain so. Such precautions are necessary when one's being invaded by pirates. All right, what do you think? How does this opening manage to work that hook? A female pirate going undercover. How does this manage to work that hook into the opening?
Let's see. So she knows she has to dress like a man. Like, you know that right away. Very strong character voice while keeping it simple. And the hook comes after a couple of paragraphs. A lot of people are just like, this is a great book. Love it. Love it.
It really is fun.
And once again, character's voice is another one that people said they can really feel that character and who that character is. So.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You know a lot about this character. They haven't dropped us into the middle of action necessarily, but it's still fairly high stakes. We know that action is going to come because obviously if you are infiltrating a group of pirates, that's probably not going to go well. All right. So as far as application, I don't know if this is blocking that. I'm reading a book on the history of glue. I can't seem to put it down. In other words, you want your opening hook to keep readers reading. So this is one thing to think about as you look at your opening. What's the hook for your story? And is that something you can allude to on the first page? If not on the first page, try and get it into the first chapter, or at least hint at it in the first chapter. One of the mistakes I see that's really common to aspiring writers is they spend way too long trying to build up the world, trying to build up the character before they get us to the interesting stuff. Your readers are really good at putting things together. You don't need to give them everything before you get to the good stuff. All right, so hook was our first one. The second one we're going to talk about is promises. What promises does your story make to readers? Because your opening chapter is kind of a contract with your reader that says, this is the kind of book you're going to get. And when you break that contract, you're going to frustrate your readers. Now this made me laugh. Can anybody tell me what is wrong with this cover to Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz?
They said it's Star Wars.
Right?
Nothing to do with the story. It's hinting that it's sci-fi, like Avatar almost.
Right?
Oh, and this one's really good. It's lying about what the book is about.
Exactly. And covers can do that, but you want to, starting with your cover, and we're not going to talk about covers because if you publish with a traditional publisher, you're probably going to have very little say in that. But you need to think about what promises are you making for your readers. You're going to make promises about what genre is this? What kind of tone does this have? Is this a funny story? Is this a serious story? Even if you're writing a horror novel and you don't get to the actual horror until chapter 2, you can use words and phrases in your opening that hint at that genre. The voice. If we get a really, I've read so many first chapters where the voice is fantastic, and so you request the rest of the book, and then discover that the author probably rewrote that first chapter 10 times and hasn't revised the rest of the book because that wonderful voice in the first chapter falls out. If you have a high stakes, high action book, you want to hint at that in the opening chapter. If you have a boring opening chapter, people are going to have the wrong expectation. And if you're a reader like me, sometimes I like reading 19th century novels, which can be very slow, but there's something luxurious about that slowness. If I'm picking up a book because I expect it to be that slow kind of luxurious story, and then I find myself in the middle of a thriller, I'm not going to be happy because that's not what I signed up for. And I can't tell you how many stories I've read that have done this. This is especially common for people that write portal fantasies, where the first chapter promises one kind of world. Like it's fun, it's funny, the main character is interacting with their friends and they're snarky. And then you fall into a different world and all of a sudden everybody is deadly serious and it's really high stakes and there's lots of blood. And that's not what I got in the first chapter. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of story, it's just that's not what the first chapter promised. Another question to ask, and I'm borrowing this term from Susan Dennard, she talks in her writing about cookies. Those are the things that readers look forward to. Are these the fun banter scenes? Are these the swoony kisses? Are these the high action scenes or the scenes of ultimate betrayal? Maybe make a list of what are the things that readers have to look forward to in your book and try and put some of those in the opening chapter so that readers know what they're getting. Here's a book that I think does an excellent job of this. This is LAINI Taylor's Strange the Dreamer, and this is the opening page. On the second Sabbath of 12th moon in the city of Weep, a girl fell from the sky. Her skin was blue, her blood was red. She broke over an iron gate, crimping it on impact, and there she hung, impossibly arched, graceful as a temple dancer swooning on a lover's arms. One slick finial anchored her in place. Its point, protruding from her sternum, glittered like a brooch. She fluttered briefly as her ghost shook loose, and torched ginger buds rained out of her long hair. Later, they would say these had been hummingbird hearts and not blossoms at all. They would say she hadn't shed blood but wept it, that she was lewd, tonguing her teeth at them, upside down and dying, that she vomited a serpent that turned to smoke when it hit the ground. They would say a flock of moths came, frantic, and tried to lift her away. That was true. Only that. Okay, what does this opening promise you about the book?
All right, let's see. It says one of the cookies is the lush fantasy descriptions.
Yes.
Those passages. Wild fantasy races, magic mystery, bloody descriptions. And a lot of people are drawn to, it's kind of like a train wreck, right? You see blood and you have to see what happens. Creepy mystery, but, and someone mentions this, like Emma Kirby mentions tone. You know,
Yes.
that the tone of the book is going to be dark. It's going to be a dark tone.
Yeah, it's dark but beautiful, and we know that terrible things are going to happen, and we know we're going to get our heart broken in this book, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of the fantastic things she does with this is you don't know who this person is until the very end of the book, and you spend the whole book afraid that you do actually know who this is. Anyway, it's a wonderful book if you haven't read it. So one of the things that you can do, again, in your own work is think about the promises you want to make to your readers. Think about the cookies. What are the best parts of your writing? What are readers going to get from your book? And sprinkle those in that opening chapter. You may want to make a list of what are the most important things to you about your story. Is it the genre? Is it the tone? What is it that you want to promise to readers? And then make sure that those show up on the front page. And this, I think most of you can relate to Debbie Ohi's cartoon, right? What's wrong? I thought you couldn't wait to start reading that book. You've been waiting months for it to come out. I know, but I just realized that once I start reading, I'll eventually get to the end of the book. And once I get to the end, that'll be it, no more. Then you could reread it. But this will be the only chance I ever have to read the book for the first time. One of the wonderful things about reading a book for the first time is getting those promises and the anticipation of those promises, and then the delight when those promises are fulfilled. So make sure that you're thinking carefully about the promises that you're making to readers. All right, another thing you want to do is questions. What questions do you want readers to have after reading your first page? We saw this with LAINI Taylor's thing, right? She has a fantastic question. Who is this person that just died? But there are lots of questions that can come up in the opening chapter. Sometimes it's the big question that's going to drive the whole story. Sometimes it's just little questions. If any of you saw the Buffy the Vampire series, one of the things that they do really well is there's often a very ordinary question that's opened in the opening scenes, like who is Xander going to ask to this particular dance? But you want to have your readers asking a question that they want the answers to. So after you read your first page or your first couple pages, ask yourself or ask a friend and say, what questions are readers going to have after reading this? Now the danger with questions is you might have too many questions. You want to make sure that there are a couple of really compelling questions, but not so many questions that readers throw your book across the room because they're frustrated. You want questions that people are going to care about and that invite readers to keep reading. All right. This is a book that unfortunately didn't get a lot of attention, but the opening chapter has some fantastic questions. This is called Denton's Little Death Date by RUBIN. And it starts this way. I don't think this is my bed. It's hard to know for sure as my head is in excruciating pain, but there's something about this bed that doesn't feel like me. It's got extra fluff. This is disappointing. I had a very clear vision for how the day of my funeral would start, and it involved waking up in my own bed. I would yawn and stretch like a well-rested comic strip character as the smell of bacon wafted up from downstairs. There's so much bacon down here, my stepmom would shout. But instead, I'm swiping at my skull to make sure there aren't any knives sticking out of it as I listen to the voice of some lady who's not my stepmom talking about something that is not bacon. All right, what kinds of questions do you have after reading this opening page? And are these questions that you want answers to?
Yeah, let's see. Is it their funeral? Who, why, when, where? Who's the lady? What is important about bacon in this story? I think that's kind of voice going in there. Why is he in pain? Why does his head hurt? Whose bed is he in? The knives leave a huge question. Where is this happening? Let's see. Oh, what is the lady talking about? If it's not his stepmom, who is it? That's a good one. Is this an out-of-body experience? Is he listening to his own funeral? And if so, why is he so chill about it? Why is he so okay with it being his funeral? That was a good question. So those are some of the questions that they put on there.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I loved about this opening. The other thing that I love about this opening is he actually doesn't take very long before he answers a lot of those questions. Within the next couple of pages, you find out what the deal is with the funeral, you find out whose bed he's in. But by that point, he's also introduced new questions, like, is he actually going to survive this day if this is supposed to be the day that he dies? So yeah, you can open it in a way that invites your readers to ask questions. Hopefully, for some of you, maybe you were like, oh, there were too many questions here. But for me, it was just the right amount of questions to want to keep reading and know what's going to happen next. And I also like that even though it's kind of a dark topic, you know that this is going to be a funny book because of the way that it opens. So again, look at your first page. Ask yourself what questions readers might have after reading it. And if you're like me and you've looked at your first page so many times, you can't tell anything about it, then hand it to a friend and say, what questions would you have after reading this? And make sure that those are questions that you want your readers to have. This is one of the most useful tips, honestly, that I can give you about opening chapters. This was sort of revolutionary for me when someone introduced it to me, and that is make a list of the first 10 things, and I don't think I have that on here, but make a list of the first 10 things that your character does. Actually, do you know what? I think I have this later. But make a list of the first 10 things that your character does and ask yourself, is this characteristic of my character? Is this what I want readers to see of this character for the first time? And make sure those things match. Again, this doesn't have to be a big question. It just has to be a question that readers want answers and are willing to keep reading to get the answer to. From Dilbert, are there any questions? Feel free to ask anything at all. Why do ghosts have clothes? If someone gives you a wedgie at the moment you die, will you have it for eternity? Again, questions don't have to be serious, but they do have to be interesting to draw readers in. All right. The next thing that I want to talk about is character voice, and this is something that a lot of you mentioned at the beginning. And I think, you know, we are willing to spend a lot of time with a character that we care about, even if there's not a ton of things happening in that opening chapter. Character voice can cover a lot of other story sins. So you want to make sure that you have a character voice. Consider, for example, this cartoon. And how, for those of you who are familiar with Dickens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Contrast the feeling you get from that with, it was the whatevs of times, it was the meh of times, right? It doesn't have quite the same feeling. So again, think about your character. What makes this character unique? Do they have a distinct voice? Are people picking up your book going to feel like, this is a character that I want to spend time with? This isn't someone I've seen before. This is from Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give, which really is a character-driven story. And so we have to be able to relate to the character. We have to care about this character from the very beginning. And so I want you to kind of pay attention to, what does she tell you in this first page about this character? I shouldn't have come to this party. I'm not even sure I belong at this party. That's not on some bougie shit either. There are just some places where it's not enough to be me, either version of me. Big D's spring break party is one of those places. I squeeze through sweaty bodies and follow Kenya, her curls bouncing past her shoulders. A haze lingers over the room, smelling like weed, and music rattles the floor. Some rapper calls out for everybody to nay-nay, followed by a bunch of haze as people launch into their own versions. Kenya holds up her cup and dances her way through the crowd. Between the headache from the loud-ass music and the nausea from the weed odor, I'll be amazed if I cross the room without spilling my drink. We break out of the crowd. Big D's house is packed wall to wall. I've always heard that everybody and their mama come to his spring break parties. Well, everybody except me, but damn, I didn't know it would be this many people. So what do we get from the character from this opening page? This is not necessarily a page that raises huge questions about the story. This isn't something that starts with a lot of action, but it starts with the character. So what do we know from the character?
You know that she's pretending to be someone she's not, or that she doesn't feel like she is.
Mm-hmm.
Elena says she doesn't like people. So much personality, very strong voice, and also, like, this is a good thing that a normal setting isn't that normal for her. That something normal is not normal. She's an outsider. She swears and complains, but it's in a likable way that you can understand.
And it is a good heads up that there's going to be language in the rest of the story because that's how she talks.
Exactly. She's a person who knows what she likes and what she doesn't like.
Yeah, but at the same time, while she knows who she is and what she likes, right? Did you catch that there are two versions of her? That was something that caught me when I first read that. And I thought, oh, I want to know why there are two versions of her and why she doesn't feel like she can ever fully be herself in any of the places she finds herself in. And that is one of the central conflicts of the story, and it shows up on the very first page. So yeah, and you know, and your character voice does not have to look like this character voice. It just has to be unique to your character. This is why the 10 action thing is. But think about what makes your character unique. Does that uniqueness show up on the first page? That's why I think it's helpful to make a list of the first 10 things your character does and ask yourself, is this representative of my character? I had a story where I thought the opening was working pretty well, but when I made a list of what the character does, I realized none of the things that she does get at who she really is. One of the big things that I wanted readers to know about her in the first chapter was that she was obedient on the surface, but not underneath. So she was constantly doing things that kind of skated the edge of being rebellious, because that was going to be important to her character arc. And so once I realized that, I was able to rewrite the beginning in a way that really reflected who the character was. I threw this in. This is Tom Gauld again, just because I thought it was funny, right? If any of you can make a vegetable narrative interesting, I would love to see that. But this is who we're going to spend the rest of the story with. So you really want to make sure that this character is someone that we care about. All right. Another way to open the story is if you have a really unique setting and you want to highlight that, especially if setting is important to your novel. With the Oz books, right? We open in a pretty ordinary place, but we know that we're not going to stay there. But think about your setting. Why do people want to spend time in this world? What are some of those cool, going back to the idea of the cookies, what are some cool parts of this world? What can you do to draw readers in? This is from Natalie Parker's book, Beware the Wild, where the setting plays a really big part in the story. It's no secret ours is the meanest swamp in Louisiana. Regular swamps are dangerous enough. Loud, stinking things, they hide their claws in the mud between cypress knees, beneath the surface of stale, brackish waters. There are 100 ways to die, all cloaked in the twist of pale trees, gators fast enough to catch a grown man, mosquitoes teeming with disease, stinging plants, hungry black bears, and nasty cottonmouths, all filled with spite and patience. Heat so dense it collects in your ears, air so thick it coats the inside of your nose, and plenty of putrid sucking mud that'll pull you down and fill your lungs with slow death. Our swamp is worse. Ours is a creature all its own. We don't stare into its depth, and we don't ever go inside. We live alongside it, tolerate it the way every southern town tolerates creeping vines of kudzu, and I've done my best to avoid it until today. All right, how does this, this is almost all about the setting. We don't get a ton about the character, but how does the author use the setting to make you want to read more?
Let's see what they come up with. I think for me, it's the dangerous aspect.
Yeah.
Says, I'm not from the South, but as someone who lives in the cryptid swamp critter land of the North, this seems accurate. Until today, it will be dangerous. Like that's kind of the promise they see in that.
Yeah.
And more about that swamp, like what makes it so unique? Because she says hers has that creature. That's kind of that question that leaves you hanging there. Why is that her swamp unique to that? And then somebody said, how is it possible that theirs could be worse than what was described? Yeah, so it still holds all those promises and still introduces a potential conflict the main character might be going through in the survival aspect of this.
Right.
That is kind of similar to if you started with a character. The setting almost becomes like part of that character.
Yeah, and stories that open like this with the setting, usually the setting is kind of like an additional character in those books. But I think she does a bunch of things here. You know, she raises some questions, right? How is this swamp worse? Why is she going into the swamp if it's so terrible? You know, these are questions that we want to know, but it also tells us about the genre, right? It's also making some promises. We know that whatever kind of story this is going to be maybe a little bit gothic, but also a lot of survival adventure. All right. So this is one thing to consider for you, another tool for your opening. Setting is a big part of your story. Is there a way to introduce that setting in the beginning? What is it that's unique about your setting that you want characters to be aware of from the beginning? And this only incidentally has to do with setting. I thought was funny, right? Why do you always insist on living in a fantasy world? And the heart says, because the real world doesn't meet with my fastidious tastes. And I am still not sure if they spelled fastidious wrong on purpose or not, but I still think it's funny. All right, the last sort of tool that I want to talk about before we get into a little bit of application is about the situation. Think about, right, that moment where your story opens. At the beginning, I asked, thinking about why this day over any other day. Or as Snoopy writes, it was a dark and stormy night. Your novel has a very exciting beginning. Thank you. Good luck with the next sentence. But think about, where is your story at the very beginning? Is there something about this opening scene that's unusual? I loved the point that someone made about Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give, that it starts with a pretty ordinary setting, a parting, but it's unusual because it's unusual for the character to be there. So be thinking about that. And if there isn't anything unusual about this opening scene, is there something you can tweak so that there is, even if it's just a shift in the way the character is viewing things? This comes from one of Stacey Lee's historical novels, Outrun the Moon, which was set around the San Francisco earthquake in the early 20th century. In my 15 years, I have stuck my arm in a vat of slithering eels, climbed all the major hills of San Francisco, and tiptoed over the graves of 100 souls. Today, I will walk on air. Tom's hot air balloon, the floating island, hovers above us, a cloud of tofu-colored silk trapped in netting. After scores of solo flights, Tom finally deemed it safe enough to bring me aboard. I run my hands over the inner wall of the bamboo basket, which strains at the stakes pinning to the ground. Both the balloon and I are itching to take off. And I think this one's pretty straightforward, but what is it about the situation that's different, that kind of draws you into the story?
Let's see. She's adventurous, going on a hot air balloon, which is kind of unique still today.
Yeah.
Completely, that's not normal. Someone else said the souls got me, like the surrealism of what was happening. It's something she's never done before, so it's brand new to her. Someone mentioned the voice. So Kieran mentioned the dramatic voice, which is hopefully going to be there throughout your entire reading.
Yeah.
The fact that the balloon is just itching to take off, and that there's this girl who's willing to go above and beyond what other people have done, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the other things that I find really interesting is there is a couple of very subtle hints here about the character. The character is actually Chinese American, which in early 20th century San Francisco was pretty significant. And there's a couple of things, the vat of slithering eels, and the fact that she calls the silk tofu colored. You get more of this later, but there are a couple of little subtle hints right there on the front page that are also important. All right. I want to give you guys just a couple of minutes to pull out whatever your most recent work is. Well, there's two parts to this. One is, on your own time, look at the opening pages of your favorite stories. What do they do to bring you in? Is that something you could mimic in your story? But the second thing is, I want you to think about these techniques that we've talked about, right? The hook for your story, the character voice, the setting, the promises that you're making to readers, this opening situation. Are there any of those things that you could make stronger in your introduction? And I want to give you just a couple of minutes to play around with that. And then we'll take some questions.
Kind of wish I had some music to play.
I know, I didn't think about that.
I should have thought too. It's fine. Some of them like quiet while they're typing anyway or working. So.
Yeah, that's me. I cannot, if I listen to music, I get distracted. So I have to have it quiet when I write.
Yep, I'm the same way.
All right, I want to come back and talk about kind of what you learned and then open up some time for any questions. So as you went back and looked at your introductions, what were some things that you observed? What are some changes that you're hoping to make? That sort of thing.
All right, we're waiting to see who is brave and comes on and tells us something here. I was gonna say too, because I've been struggling, like I've been trying to write a book for like a while now, and I've been struggling with the first chapter of that, rewritten it 10 times. And what you said about knowing what the ending is going to be just totally flipped that for me. So I'm like, I need to figure out the ending, and then I can figure out which beginning best exemplifies where I want it to go. So that was helpful information for me. Okay.
Yeah, I found that if I don't know where the story is going to end yet, it's often hard to know where it's going to begin. So I just will put in like a placeholder beginning. And then when I finish it, I can come back and say, okay, this from the beginning is necessary because we'll need that, but this is not because it's not going to set up the story I'm telling. So it's okay if you don't know your beginning yet because you haven't finished it.
Ooh, people are writing some really good things in the chats here. So Emma said, I've been meaning to rewrite my intro for over a year, but one thing I've always seen is I tend to start a small arc that gets concluded quickly before I even get into the real meat of the story. So she needs to probably introduce that big arc, right?
Yeah, I think you can have overlapping arcs. I think it's okay to start with a small arc, especially if that gets us into the story and we need, you know, sometimes you need to establish a little bit more about the character and the world before we will even understand what the big arc is. But I think those arcs can overlap. I think you can start that big arc before you've resolved the little one.
Yeah. And Samantha has one that would be good too, because it's almost like a question. She says, I need to add more characterization and I need more tension. I'm not really explaining what's important about my characters, and that's a problem. She just has no idea how to do that. Any
Well, so,
advice?
yeah, on the tension thing, I think sometimes we think that tension has to be these big, high stakes thing, and it doesn't have to be huge stakes. It just has to be something that matters to the character. And tension comes from conflict. It can come from internal conflict, a character that's torn about stuff. So we can get tension in dialogue when characters are talking with each other, but they're not telling us, they're not really telling the truth. Like they say one thing, but they think something else. That will introduce tension. Even just little conflicts, like I like to ask, you know, what is my character's goal in this scene and what's keeping her from that goal? And even having other characters get in the way, even if it's just like your character really desperately wants a drink of water and people keep interrupting them, that can give you tension, especially in an opening chapter where you don't yet have the big high stakes stuff going on. You can think about what's a little goal my character could have that keeps getting frustrated, and that can help bring some tension into the story. Mary Robinette Kowal has a great trick that she uses where she says, yes and or no but. Sorry, I got that backwards. Yes, but, no, and. So you ask yourself, what is my character's goal? Does my character succeed? And the first part is, yes, she succeeds, but it introduces this new complication. Like maybe your character is kind of falling for someone and something happens that moves their relationship forward. That's a good thing, they're accomplishing one goal, but that might introduce new complications to the story. Or no, they don't achieve their goal, and then this is how the situation gets worse. So if you're struggling with that, coming up with tension, you can try asking yourself that, you know, what is my character's goal? Does he achieve it? Yes, but, or no, and then it gets worse in this way. Those are some things that I've found helpful.
That's really good. So several of these were just ways that what you've taught them today has really helped. So someone said, I need to change my beginning from an average day to something that's just a little more out of the ordinary. And I think that's really common, like because you always are told, let everybody know what the world was like before that inciting incident or something, but how long to do that?
Yeah. We need a slice of the character's normal so that we understand how big the change is, but that slice may only be a paragraph or two. Like it doesn't have to be a ton of, and then maybe it's even up to a chapter, as long as you're hinting at something bigger to come. I do want to say one thing about prologues while we're talking about that. You've probably heard lots of conflicting advice about prologues. One of the reasons that people tend to dislike prologues is they're terrible at making promises. People often include a prologue because they know somehow that their opening chapter isn't interesting enough. So they put this really cool prologue at the beginning and readers get pulled in, and then we get dumped in this very ordinary, very boring opening chapter, and you're not following through on a promise. I think a prologue can work if it serves a specific purpose in the story, but if you're just putting the prologue in because you think your opening chapter isn't interesting enough, I think ditch the prologue and make your opening chapter interesting.
Let's see. Let's see. So someone said, I just realized that the payoff for my prologue was not clear enough. Too many unanswered questions within that.
Yeah.
Does anyone, because a lot are commenting in the chat, but do any of you have questions, like burning questions that you need help with something in your chapters that you would like to get? So remember that Q&A button should be at the bottom of your screen if you would like to ask a question that Rosalyn can answer, because you have a great mind here to answer any of those burning questions you might have. One thing I have to say too, because I used to run the first chapter contest with the Teen Author Bootcamp conference for probably the first, I don't know, like 6 years of the conference, I ran that first chapter contest. And just every single thing that you put in here, if there was a problem in the chapter, you could pinpoint it to one of those things, like too information overload or too many questions with no resolution to anything. Because I think a lot of people think in the first chapter, I'm supposed to have all of these questions, but you also need some kind of a resolution to some of those questions pretty early on. So this question just came in from Jules. How do you write a good opening sentence? I have a good first page, but the first sentence is hard for me.
You know, I wish I had a good answer for that. In my experience, sometimes they just come, like you just have this inspiration and you know exactly what the first line is. Sometimes I really have to wrestle with it. I think for me, it kind of comes down to the promises that I want to make. What is the tone of the book that I'm writing? What is the character voice? And I'll play around with that opening sentence so that it does one of those things, like establishes that tone or helps establish the character voice. One thing you can do is look at the kind of story you're writing and find some of your favorite books that are that same kind of story, that same genre or a similar tone, and look at how they're opening it. Sometimes I get ideas when I do it that way. And sometimes I just have to write like 50 different sentences until I find one that works.
And then Leela says, is there a point in writing your story that the idea just isn't worth it anymore?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I've seen people spend years and years on a story, but I think it's so individual to each person. I think as long as you still care about the story and you still have ideas about the story, it's okay to keep working on it. But it's also okay to say, I'm going to put the story in the, metaphorical drawer for a little while and work on something else and come back. I also know people who have written a story that wasn't working. They put it aside for a few months, even a few years, wrote other stuff, and then came back to it and knew how to fix it. So I think as long as you have an idea for how to work with the story you're working on, keep working on it. If you get stuck or if it's not bringing you joy at all, that's probably time to at least take a break from it.
Yeah, this is a good one too, because this was something I saw a lot in the first chapter contest. So it says, is it bad to have your character introduce themselves in the first paragraph?
I have seen books do it well, but I've seen a lot more books do it badly. Readers really just need a little bit of information. If you want to get information about what the character looks like, you can weave it in kind of subtle ways. You brush a strand of red hair back from your face, or it's a little harder if it's in first person, right? Because we don't usually walk around thinking about how we look or observing that to ourselves, right? We just know that. So I think it's important. I think the level of detail is going to depend on your character and how observant your character is and how much they notice. I think for a character that is very self-conscious about their looks, yeah, it would be natural for them to be thinking about that. I remember listening to an author, Kathleen Dewey, talk about how she'd written an entire book and she never once described the character, and lots of readers didn't even notice. I think what we're really more interested in is what's on the inside rather than the external stuff, but if that's important to the story, I would try and find subtle ways to bring it in. I don't think that needs to be in the opening paragraph though, because that's not the first thing readers really want to know.
Let's see. So someone else said, so Peyton, I feel like my writing is too condensed and short. What would you suggest I do to make it fuller, longer?
I would keep writing the way you're writing for the first draft. And then when you go back and revise, because you know this is something about your stories, when you go back, you can flesh stuff out. You can look at dialogue and think, is there a character action that I could add in here that would tell me something about the character? One of my rules of thumb is that the level of detail depends a little bit on the engagement that I want. That if I want it to be really fast paced, I'm going to have minimal description because the description will interrupt the story. If it's a big emotional moment, then I need to slow it down, and you slow it down by adding description, by adding words that will emphasize the mood of that particular piece. because those big emotional moments, that's where we really want to feel with the character. So you can slow it down by adding description. So once you've got an initial draft, I would go back through and then mark the places that you want to keep fast. Don't add a lot there. Mark the places where you want people to slow down, either because you need to give them information or because it's an important scene that you want them to absorb, and then flesh out those sections. But I wouldn't worry about it the first draft, because it sounds like that's your writing style. It's good that you're aware of that and you can work on that in revisions. Margie, you're muted.
Sorry, I was having a technical issue. I'm wondering if you could switch me over as being the host.
Oh, yes. Okay, I'm gonna have to stop sharing, I think, to do that.
Oh, okay. Oh, there's such good questions in here.
All right, you should be the host now.
Okay. So this one says, how do you know when a character isn't going to be able to make it into the story? For example, I wrote my first draft, and when I started my second draft, I realized that 2 of my MC characters aren't going to be able to work as I wanted, but I really, really don't want to get rid of them.
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
For me, it always comes down to, like in the first draft, I'll put whatever in that I want to. But when I'm revising, I really have to ask, what is the point of the story? What is this character doing? Is this character pulling their weight? I've had to get rid of characters when I realized this character doesn't add anything to the story. There's another character that serves almost exactly the same function, and I could combine those 2 characters and it would be simpler. So I think you have to just get really honest with yourself. Is the character serving the story? And if they're not, you either need to make the hard choice to get rid of them, or if you're really attached to them, you need to figure out a way to make them pull their weight in the story so that their arc is just as critical as the other point of view characters.
All right, that's so good. So that's all the time that we have, but thank you so much. And you can purchase Rosalyn's books once again through the King's English. That link is on the main page on our webpage. So when you go there, you can get in, go buy her books. You can tell her writing is amazing. You will not regret it. And thank you so much, Rosalyn. That was excellent.
One thing, my website is the same as my name. If you Google it, it should show up. And if you have other questions, there is a contact me on my website that you can email me your questions, and I'd be happy to answer them.
Oh, perfect. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll see you later.